Thank you very much. Hello again, everybody. I love it when I'm wearing the same suit on stage that they found on my, my profile photo. At least it's a different tie.
All you need is one.
So thank you for that introduction. And I was sitting at the back listening to Hal Gregerson and thinking about how to introduce this session. Just to summarize what I think I heard Hal saying was questions, asking good questions is important, and being wrong is very important. So on that last point, I performed really well. I'm usually wrong. But hopefully today I'll manage to do some things right. We're really very fortunate to be joined here for this panel discussion by two people who have, I think, exceptional personal stories in terms of their journeys to their current roles. And also I can say from the conversations that we've had in the run-up to this panel, their companies and their industries are really facing very significant challenges and opportunities in a number of ways that we'll get to talk about shortly. And they are both extremely thoughtful, I have found, about those challenges, about how their organizations and companies need to respond, and how they personally address their role as a CFO and leading the finance function. But not only leading the finance function, but also being a leader in their business. And we had some words about this, I think, in the introduction to this session, that all of you as CFOs face this challenge now, this dilemma, I think was the word that we used. What's it mean to simultaneously be strategic and be an innovator? In academia, in business schools, actually, we lump those two things together quite often, strategy and innovation. That's one of our groups of faculty at MIT. But as I think about it, they can be very different things. They can mean very different things. And how to combine, as a CFO, the imperative to not only defend against innovation, because all of the larger businesses that might be represented here have a lot of competitors who are driving innovation, competitors that you might not even have heard of who are competing with you and disrupting you. And yet you need to really be a strategic partner in your business as it grows. And so, if I may, what I thought we could just start by doing is asking each of Sandra and John just to tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you get to the role that you're currently in, and what are the times that you encountered this dilemma between strategy and innovation along that way? Perhaps we could start with you, Sandra.
So both of my alma maters are represented here today. I was saying I have a degree from MIT and I have a master's in accounting from Bentley. So hello, everybody. I've been in a number of industries, and I found them to be under different pressure and having to respond to it. And some of them chose to respond in ways that propelled them forward, and others responded in ways where they retrenched, and it was, let me just get through this. Right now, I'm in healthcare from the side of the health plan, working for Blue Shield of California. Previously, I was with a pharmaceutical company as the US financial head, and before that, medical device, and I've been in several other industries as well. And I would say that in the 10 plus years I've been in healthcare, it's undergone a lot of change. And right now, for Blue Shield, we describe our mission as we want to create a healthcare system that's worthy of our family and friends and sustainably affordable. That's a big, ambitious goal out there. And the way I would differentiate for us right now between strategy and innovation is that we have a strategy on a page in terms of the different elements of the ecosystem that we want to influence in order to truly change how healthcare is delivered. That strategy includes a number of things that are just be brilliant at the basics. And then there is another section that is around innovation. So your strategy can have innovation as a component. It is not necessarily all about innovation. I think innovation is strategically inserted into your longer term strategy. It's not necessarily the whole strategy, nor should it be.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just a few comments about I guess, my journey is most of my career in one way, shape, or form has been in and around financial services. More recently, and the second half of my career, primarily focused on banking. And banking over the years has gone through a variety of upheavals. And I've been part of that story in one way, shape, or form. I was the CFO of one of the top 3 mortgage companies in the U.S. in the mortgage crisis. So those were some choppy seas. But as we like to say, those create good sailors. And during those times, if you can survive them. But banking, as I was saying right before we got up on stage, banking's being attacked from all sides. A bank, when you just break it down, we take deposits, we make loans, we facilitate payments, and we provide services. Each of those 4 categories has any number of, call it half a dozen to a dozen, incredibly well-funded, small company startups that we like to call fintechs that are attacking our profit pools. And they're attacking our profit pools because they're fighting for your business. And so over my career, it's been accelerating and getting more intense. This concept of innovate or die, and in many ways of thinking, every company is in a state of decay from the moment it produces a profit pool that is very desirable. I think that profit pool begins to become attractive, it gets competed, gets copied, and begins to decay unless one continues to innovate. Back to the whole issue of strategy versus innovation, I agree with the way Sandra depicted it. I mean, strategy in one way of saying is, you set direction. These are the customers I'm going to target, these are the products and services I'll provide, these are the capabilities we need to create to succeed in the marketplace. All of that's clear. And one way to distinguish is strategies have, in my view, a higher likelihood of being successful. They're not terribly revolutionary in their construct, but nevertheless you have to work hard and deliver on the strategy and pick the places where you're going to play. I think innovation can be distinguished. It's generally a new idea or a collection of processes that have been invented is a good word to describe it, that gets commercialized into a good or service. And my own twist on that is that has the very high likelihood or very high potential of creating outsized returns. Otherwise, it's not worth the journey, to use the phrase, to go down the path of innovation. And I think what we tend to try to do as CFOs is to distribute the allocation of capital amongst those things that are very likely to succeed, but sprinkle in a variety of initiatives that are less likely to succeed, but if they do, they will create outsized returns and therefore create another curve of returns that can be relied upon into the future that inevitably will get disrupted. And so it's a virtuous circle of investment that we get to participate in. So let me just stop there and kick it back to you.
Thanks. I'm interested, how would each of you contrast from your own experience, that kind of description you just gave, between the established and mature companies that you're very involved with, and perhaps some of the higher growth, earlier stage companies that perhaps many people in today's audience are actually working in right now?
So I saw something recently where you could define innovation as something that is both novel and useful. And when you're in an earlier stage company, typically your reason for being is that you have something novel and useful. So you're an innovation in and of itself. And what I've seen for a lot of mature companies is exactly what John was describing, that you just sprinkle in a little bit of money to try some innovative things. What we're trying to do right now is set aside a pretty sizable amount of money just focused on innovation and experiments and pilots. And we even set up a different criteria for evaluating, approving, and prioritizing those initiatives, that they have to have a hypothesis on what we're going to learn. And it should not be done right now with an intent for scale, but rather to see what's possible. And so that money and that criteria are completely separated from how we would evaluate a typical capital expenditure, which I think is important because if you're trying to apply the same degree of prioritization of financial return, it's just never going to make it. It's like one of the speakers said today that your justification for a new finance system will almost never get to the top of the list above something that's clearly revenue generating. Well, an innovation project in many ways won't either unless you come up with some really wild pie in the sky estimate of what it's going to return. And the thing about innovation that you know from the beginning is part of what you think is it's going to be wrong. And so you shouldn't be making those kinds of commitments. That's what you're trying to learn.
Yeah, I'll just add a few other thoughts if I don't cough myself to death here. Sorry about that, Sandra. Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in mostly mature entities throughout my career. But I think that what's important is exactly what Sandra was saying, which is to remain focused and innovative on profit pools, both your own profit pools as well as those of your competitors, and continue to focus on ways to add value over time. And you can do that through building new capabilities or partnering with early stage enterprises, which we've done in a variety of ways to accelerate capability building or buy. So an acquisition of an entity is a disruptive event for any organization and tends to create capabilities that are new and interesting and allow you to continue that innovation curve. So, like I said earlier, you could probably rattle off 30 to 40 to 50 companies right now that are attempting to completely steal the entire profit pools of the banking industry. And they're all funded out of San Francisco primarily, but in the Valley. And so the response as a bank is to basically create your own internal fintechs. That's the name we give them, right? And we call them fintechs, financial technology companies, but we create our own internal fintechs. We have frenemies, as we like to say. They're sort of friends, but they're kind of enemies, where we partner with someone who's trying to steal our profit pool, but they find it interesting to partner with you, and we have something to gain out of that relationship. So we have a variety of partnerships that we've entered into where both sides learn, and we've acquired on those capabilities as well. But it's absolutely essential. Change has never been greater than it is today. I think some would argue we're in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution. The first was the steam engine, the second was electricity, the third was the semiconductor, and now we're in 5G, AI, robotics, cloud, blockchain, you name it. I tend to agree with that concept. And I think it's going to be absolutely, the winners are going to be those that are smart enough to innovate and remain relevant. And I think that's the key is strategy kind of, allows you in the game, but I think innovation creates relevancy and is a future-proof way to manage.
I would add to that to your list about joint ventures and acquiring. We've certainly done a lot of partnering with some of these new digital technology companies and trying to figure out where we can utilize them. The other thing is that, by the way, I'm a not-for-profit. I pay a boatload of taxes as a not-for-profit, but we're still not-for-profit. And we've actually stood up a for-profit subsidiary that we can use to do some of this innovation, because when you're trying to attract the talent that you need to really do these disruptive things, people want to have that kind of upside potential that you would get in a for-profit with the possibility of going public in the future. So for a large, mature company, these incubators, whether you make them a separate legal entity or not, can often be a way to promote that innovation in a more contained way so that it's not a distraction for the people trying to continue with the everyday, let's get on with the business stuff.
That's interesting. So one thing I think you're both saying is that in different ways, either internally but also externally, you're creating and nurturing these kinds of ecosystems, and you're in some ways acting like startups inside your large organizations, but also having to figure out how to work with these very early stage startups and also the higher growth companies that are a bit more mature. So from sitting inside a large, mature company, what's that like, and what do people who are in
Entertaining.
high growth companies that are trying to be in your ecosystem, do you have any advice for them for how to interface with you and how to actually be able to create value jointly?
I think it's entertaining to watch, quite honestly. You've got very large established processes, lots of controls in place, and I'm in a highly regulated industry. Nobody wants their healthcare data out there in the cloud. And then you've got a lot of these smaller startups, no disrespect meant to anybody in the room, where those types of regulations around data security and privacy and all of the other CMS regulations are not top of mind, much like I would suspect for you. And so you're trying to marry that energy and that creativity with those rules and regulations. And so trying to find how you can get the cultures to work together is, I would say, one of the most challenging things. Both sides have lots of bright, passionate people who want the same ultimate goal, and that's how you get there. But that process along the way can be really challenging because of just that difference in the habit of how one side has worked and the lack of depth and understanding on the other side sometimes.
Yeah, I would say that, if you're a small company, the first thing you do when you interact with a bank or a large mature entity is the first thing you say is, so much bureaucracy, so much process, so much unnecessary wasted time. And I would say that's partly true, but not all the way true. And I think having the wisdom to sift through what is truly bureaucracy versus what is, because large companies can learn this way, right? There's a continuum. You've got chaos on the one side and bureaucracy on the other, and hopefully in the middle there's this virtuous place called being well controlled, right? Where you're attempting to create, when you have like we do 18,000 employees or 17 or 18,000 employees, we need policies, procedures, and controls so that we all go to the same place together. And it's not 20 people all in a room being able to get the message out. So I think we as large companies have a lot to learn in terms of how to be agile. And I think that small companies have a lot to learn about how to scale. And I think we have something to offer each other, and that's what's so exciting about those partnerships. And when and if we jump into these partnerships, and we have about a dozen of them, they're incredibly important to the products and services that we provide into the marketplace. And we both learn from each other when we interact. Both sides get something out of the arrangement, and that's the point of the partnership.
Great. You both directly or indirectly talked about data or mentioned data in those answers. And of course, we're kind of used now to the idea that there's somebody called a chief data officer, or that there's a whole bunch of different executives who might feel that they own the field of data. But sitting in the CFO seat, how do you think about the role of data and increasingly analytics, and maybe even some of the AI that we're starting to see deployed, certainly in these startups that are nipping at your heels, but maybe also in some of the mature companies?
Sure, you ready to go?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and kick it off there. I mean, this is a big part of what is clearly in the banking industry. Data is in a couple of different comments. One is, I think data, in the past, scale meant assets. For banks, if you're Bank of America or JP Morgan or what have you, we call them the Trillionaires Club, right? If you have $1 trillion of assets or more, and you have 5,000 branches, and everywhere you turn, there's another one. That's scale, right? And I think that was true for the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, et cetera. But increasingly today, that still is scale, but there's another way to scale. And the other way to scale, in my view, is through data and technology. And so there's a correlation there, but it's not exclusive. I think the barriers to scale have never been lower with the confluence of technology and data. And monetizing data is really, underpins everything that we do. Millennials these days are a big part of the demographics of the United States, similar to baby boomers in terms of size. And their expectations are, me before I've even told you anything about me. It's the Amazon effect and the Uber effect you've mentioned. They come off those websites, they come onto our website, and they're saying, why don't you know me already? Where's the personalization? I want you to know me. I want you to meet me in my channel of choice. I just put down my cell phone and I walked into the branch. Why hasn't all that data already made its way to the teller? Why doesn't the teller know everything that I just did on my cell phone? that kind of experience, that customer demand for harnessing data has never been greater. That's on the customer-facing side, and I'll just make one other comment on non-customer facing, which is where we have to play in, we have to be ambidextrous as CFOs, we have to do both. And in the back office, the ability to export, transform, load, and manage and cleanse data is the difference between having a really efficient back office and having one that is either getting things completely wrong, which is a regulatory problem, or just not being efficient, which is again an issue for the company as a whole. Those, an entity that has a lower price point can lower their prices and still maintain the same profit margins if they're more efficient than you are. Data is clearly, I think, 10 years ago we heard about big data, or at least I did, and I wasn't so sure that was going to mean much, I have to admit, 10 years ago. But today, it's like electricity was, 150 years ago. It's that important.
I would say big data 10 years ago was like some of those really big screen TVs, or you knew they were kind of cool, but you couldn't exactly figure out how much it was going to be useful in your day-to-day life. Well, we figured it out. On the data side, in the healthcare world, you've got a couple of competing requirements there. Much like John is describing, many people want that same consumer experience when it comes to having their healthcare delivered, whether it's looking up information from their health plan, or it's just how they interact with their doctors and the hospitals for services. And yet at the same time, nobody wants their data to be easily accessible to the wrong people. And there are a lot of entities out there that contact me on a regular basis trying to get access to the healthcare data that we have. We have over 4 million members, and they want to monetize it. And we don't believe that that's appropriate. So trying to strike that balance between working with people to make the best use of the data for our members, to make sure that we're the most cost efficient, that we are getting ahead of trends in particular diseases, and that we're working with providers on the right types of interventions, that's all very important. At the same time, making sure you've limited that data, or certainly the personal data, to the highest degree possible, and that you're completely following the regulations on that. We actually have not gone to one fully centralized data officer because of that. So the actuarial data, which drives a lot of our forecasting, and the financial data resides with me. And then under our Chief Information Officer, we have a lot of this other more detailed healthcare data. And we have separate books of record, as we call it, and there are lots of protocols. So this is one of those places where we are highly bureaucratic. And when smaller companies come to work with us in some of these more innovative areas, they get highly frustrated by that. I get highly frustrated by it. But there's a good reason behind it. And so I think particularly when you're working with very sensitive data for consumers, their financial information, their healthcare information, probably several other areas you can think of as well, that you have to strike that balance around how and where that data resides.
So that, in some ways, that paints a slightly siloed picture for what sound like very smart risk management kinds of reasons, and that, I think, leads us into a couple of lines of questioning. First of all, on this question of risk management, there are traditional ways that we all understand that as a CFO you would think about and feel responsible for risk. But as a leader in the business and in these large businesses, are there new ways that you as an executive find that you are having to be a part of the senior leadership team of the business, and how that's different from, or what skills you felt you needed to add to enable you to succeed in that way?
I would say that in addition to the traditional way that I've always looked at financial returns and the size of the investment in whatever the new initiative was, we've actually come up with what we call our risk framework, which sounds very cumbersome, but what it essentially did is we sat down and said, for these key elements in our strategy, what's our risk appetite for each of these? How much risk are we willing to take on in order to try something innovative and in order to execute the strategy or execute it faster? And we've gone through everything from legal, which has no tolerance and compliance, the things like the Medicare regulations, no tolerance, to are we willing to take on a medium degree of risk if we're going to try something innovative more on the sales side. And by participating with the other executives in creating that appetite framework, it's actually helped the conversation a lot when it comes to these ideas around things that we want to try and the partners that we want to bring in to do it, because we've already agreed on this, and it helps the rest of the organization understand what we're willing to tolerate and therefore what's even worth bringing forward.
And maybe just going back to the data point that you made earlier, because I think data can be an offensive tool or a defensive tool, and when you think about it on the defensive side of things, there are examples across many banks, but ours included. What are we reconciling data from one system to another, one source system to another is an important part of what we do, and ensuring that when we're managing risk, you mentioned one of the big risks we manage are financial reporting risk. We're a public company. We have a very large investor base. They rely on our information to be accurate. If it's not, lots of bad things happen, and so including CFOs looking for new jobs and stuff like that, right? So the ensuring that that's accurate is so essential. And what's interesting is that the combination of access to very good data and one of the other themes that I know are part of this conference and part of what everyone's talking about, which is we say AI, but there's really complex neural networks AI, and there's actually just rules-based engines and algorithms that are probably not exactly AI, but nevertheless get lumped in. And I think that in managing risks, I think that it's our view that we can be more efficient and more effective by deploying data in a powerful way through the use of sometimes very simple algorithmic techniques, whether it's robotics or what have you, and thereby managing our to a lower risk profile and frankly getting a dividend through higher efficiencies as a result. Banks are all about risk management. We have a chief risk officer. We have a chief data officer. We have a chief financial officer. My job is primarily first line. I have at least 3 or 4 of the 8 risks that we manage at a bank, whether it's managing liquidity risk or interest rate risk and financial reporting risk. And data management is just absolutely core to a risk manager's capability to deliver against that mandate.
So I think it would be fair to say, if we're hearing anything in the descriptions that you're giving that we don't feel confident in our own skill sets at the moment, then these would be good things to pay attention
absolutely.
to.
Yeah.
How do you learn? How do you keep abreast?
I'll dive in. I mean, I think any new thing that's happening, and in part of you asked about Journey earlier, just having a passion for new concepts and being the source of change inside the organization, taking on that mandate forces you to be current with emerging trends. And so, from my perspective, it's participating in events like this. It's also having a very close network of people within your industry that you constantly benchmark yourself against. And it's putting yourself back through school all of the time. There's plenty of material that exists on any topic that you want to be an expert on. And it's making the time to decide that I'm going to be an expert in artificial intelligence, and therefore I'm going to read the top 3 books that have been published about artificial intelligence, and I'm going to do the work to decide how how those use cases that come out of that academic pursuit could be commercialized inside of an organization that I'm in. I'm going to pay attention, and inside, put the pressure on yourself to be the expert inside your organization. Work with external vendors and those that are constantly wanting to sell you products. The consultants out there, they will educate you for free as well. Use all of those techniques, but most importantly, put the pressure on yourself to be the expert in the trend that you think is important, and your dedication to that and the fact that you will add energy to that will be the difference between adding value inside the organization or not. And then what you're going to do is you're going to demand everyone else do the same. You're going to elevate the capabilities across the whole organization.
How CFOs get the rap for saying no a lot? Mm-hmm. Well, I think my primary word is why, especially moving into a new organization. Why? Why do we do it that way? Why is the regulation written that way? Whatever it might be. And the more why that I ask, the more I learn. And also I make it a practice wherever I am to go and speak to the functions outside of finance and how they do their jobs and why they do them that way. Our Chief of Human Resources calls it maintaining a learning posture, and that you should always do that. I'm actually working on a master's in healthcare law right now on a very slow
In your spare time.
Yes, but it helps you to keep your brain in that learning and that querying mode, I think. I love coming to CFO Leadership Council meetings every month because I get to hear different perspectives from different sized companies, and the topics are always good. I can have at least one takeaway that I can go and explore about how it applies to my organization. I agree, wherever you can find other sources to get different perspectives, especially sources that view your particular industry from another angle. So I joke that when I left pharmaceutical industry to come to health plans, some people told me I was coming to the dark side, and some people said I was coming from the dark side. But the point being that they have very different perspectives on one another. So wherever you can learn how somebody outside your industry views it, I think that helps you to continue to learn more, and it then makes you go off in search of some of these other topics.
We're going to have the CFO of the Boston Red Sox here later. You can ask him what his view of the dark side is.
Probably white with little blue stripes on their shirts.
Yeah. Maybe so. So over lunch, we all had a really great exercise in how to ask catalytic questions. So I'm hoping that perhaps out here we have some folk who may have some questions that they want to ask. We don't have a lot of time, so I may, if you'll allow me, be a bit academic about this and define what a question is. A question should be no more than 2 sentences and end in a question mark. If you'd like to speak longer than that, we could do it in the break. So I think we have some roving mics if anybody does have a burning question that they really feel they need to ask. And I can't see very much of the audience, so if you're there and you're waving your hand in the air, wave it higher. Anyone? Oh, I think we've stunned them into silence.
Sure.
Or we fed them into silence. One of the two. So maybe we're perhaps just getting to wrapping up then. I thought your answers to how you learn were extremely insightful, and I'd encourage everyone to really pay attention to that. Of course, I would say that given what my day job is. But what is one thing that you think everybody that's in this room today, maybe not when they get out into the break, but maybe when they get back to the office later this week, that you hope that they do, that they might not be doing right now?
I'll go ahead and kick off unless you've got something. I think, from my standpoint, I think, as a public entity that, I interface with investors a lot, and those of you that pay attention to that space, may know the term activist investor, and from time to time, it's not a bad practice. Sometimes boards will actually go through a formal exercise to say, okay, at once a year, where you say, okay, if an activist investor who would like to disrupt the pace of change at a given organization were to knock on our door, how would we respond? And what would we do differently to basically write the chapters that would make us feel good if someone were to say, listen, you're not moving fast enough, or you're not being innovative enough, or you're not being focused enough on the things that you need to do from an efficiency standpoint. And so my advice would be to consider being the activist inside your organizations on a day-to-day and a week-to-week basis. I mean, I think one of the, you can break down the role of a CFO in lots of different ways, as a risk manager, as an operator, and and the like, driving revenues. But I think as a catalyst for change is maybe one of the fundamental expectations that a CEO and a board and an investor base has of a CFO. We have the independence and the objectivity to see the landscape as well as anyone in the organization, maybe other than the CEO, and possibly more than the CEO, because we spend more time on it than he or she does. So from that perspective, that one thing would be go in with a catalytic mindset, be optimistic about it, no, not dark and gloomy, but have an optimistic, activist, catalytic mindset about change, and be formal about how you put the management routines in place to basically execute against what you're observing the gaps might be. So not bureaucratic, but optimism without a plan is not going to get you there, right? So you got to basically have a plan. So those were 3 or 4 of my top, only one thing that I would tell you to do.
I'd probably be the same way. I'd say the takeaway that I would ask you to have is innovation is a process. Creativity gets you the great ideas. Innovation is the process of turning them into something useful. And so you need to have some process around innovation, but it should not be the same one that you run your typical capital expenditure idea through. If you were going to go back and find the person within your organization who is either the official or de facto innovation leader and partner up with them to learn what their priorities are and how the two of you can move them forward in the way that helps you from a risk management perspective the most and moves them the farthest along, I think that would be incredibly impactful. Our head of innovation said to me, "You're not like most CFOs I've worked for," because I wasn't telling him no, I was saying let's figure out how. And I think everyone in this room is here because we do believe in these 7 pillars and we do want to be the how and the people that help move the business forward. And that's a place in a way where you can really demonstrate that to other parts of the organization.
I think that's a great note to end on, why and how. So thank you, Sandra. Thank you, John. This has been a fascinating conversation.
Pleasure.